I'm Pavithir V. Bharadwaj. Welcome to episode 51 of Genesis of Tomorrow. This one is going to be another solo discourse of mine, which it's a reflection, a ruminative, contemplative reflection of sorts. It's been more than around a year since the podcast began. It's been 50 episodes. We are 50 episodes in, and I wanted to talk a little bit about things that I learned, and particularly in the year that just went by, because in many ways, in more ways than one, it was indeed one of those periods in my individual journey where I did a lot. And when I say that I did a lot, I mean or I refer to the act of execution, of enforcement, of a ton of constructive input by the entity that is me. And so 1 year, 50 conversations in, that's enough to be able to notice patterns in a rather sufficient manner. And so this is not about discussing victory laps or celebrating any wins. It is more about stepping back and taking a very systems thinking, a first principles approach for auditing the reality that I treaded through. And maybe through that, allowing you to recalibrate the direction for the times ahead right now that you are about to tread through. And the very first aspect that I realized, that was realized to me, was that it really is not about victory or winning in any sense. It is just about sense making. What does that pertain to? Well, regardless of the magnitude of the effort that you put in, the hours that you put in, the the sweat and blood that goes into anything worth doing, there is absolutely no guarantee, let alone anything that the world owes to you for putting all of that in towards achieving something, and thereby there is no guarantee for fulfillment in terms of magnificence that people fancy before pursuing any endeavor. I'm a huge proponent of having enormous ideals, have ideals that are worth chasing. But in the same breath, it becomes almost seminal to also realize that even after you run with all that you've got, it in the end doesn't have to give you returns in the form that you expect it to. What did having these long form conversations taught me? A lot of things, but one very key aspect, that preparation alone by itself, it never is enough to achieving anything, or at least the version of anything that you want to. When you start running in the race on the race day is when you realize whether you are of the cadre that will enable or allow you to win, or you aren't. Before that, regardless of how much you practice, how hard you run, how consistent or disciplined you are, it does not grant you the memorandum of victory on the day, in the moments where it truly matters, and thereby do not attribute the fulfillment of your efforts to merely winning. That was a very roundabout way of saying that the destination is not more important than the journey, or, well, the journey is more important than the destination, as it goes. You know the reality behind talking to a lot of really smart people? First, it allows you to understand why depth is slow in its predisposition. True depth, true understanding of any form of essence of any subject matter is gradual. There is no way to cut the process short, to cut the chase. The chase is rather the part that allows the depth to muster through to you. Talking to a lot of really smart people, there's actually a lot that goes behind that. The research work, the follow ups, the attempt at synthesizing of what you'd want to talk about, so that you aren't just a dumb statue that's sitting in front of them while they are ranting on and on about, and you are able to fathom and comprehend the outline of what they are trying to relay or convey to you. That is what slowly carves out the depth inside of you. And even though that depth is being carved out, that depth that is being built by thorough preparation does not, by its virtue, guarantee success. It does not guarantee that when I sit with a veteran scientist, a seasoned researcher, a engineer who's been through the thick and thin of his domain, that I'll be able to understand and be able to carry forward a technical deliberation with them. And many a times that's what happens. I'm not. But because the depth was deep enough, is why even though I may not be able to get that ace, I still am able to land in that 80 to 90% bracket, and that is not unworthwhile. And let's say for you it isn't that 80 to 90% bracket, it's maybe 40, 50, 60 bracket, percent bracket. I mean, that's fine. As long as had you not prepared, you would have been X. And if you prepared your X plus whatever value, that's pretty lit. And what I really underestimated about consistency and patience is that a lot of the cognitive load that follows through with consistency and patience and thereby discipline is due to things not being specifically repetitive. To just be able to do things again and again and again and again, you need, at least at the starting phases, you need the thing itself to be as specific and then as repetitive as it can be. For example, maybe you wanna lose a few pounds, you know, garner on some muscles. Okay, so you wanna hit your protein requirements and you wanna make sure you are in a caloric deficit. Well, what do you do? One meal every single day. And when I say one meal, it's not like one meal a day. It's like the menu must remain the same, day in, day out. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, throughout the week, throughout the month, and months, the menu remains the same. Is that the only way? Maybe not. Is that the most optimized way? Depends on what you're optimizing for. If you're optimizing for satiation, it is not, certainly not. But if you're optimizing for consistency, patience, and discipline with as little cognitive load as possible, then yes, it is. And sacrifice, this is the other thing. So the first was that it is not about victory, it is about sense making. Yeah, so to wrap up this first point, the goal is to not achieve success in accordance to the definition that you have prior to starting the process of getting to the destination, towards before starting the journey itself. The goal, the objective is to make sense, to make better sense, and to make better and better sense as you go along. And eventually that may lead to either that precursor definition that you harbored of success, or it may lead you to land onto a point on the 3D plane where you actually realize that where you are is better than where you thought you wanted to be. The second thing is that sacrifice is the only currency that buys greatness. There are no roundabout ways to that. You need to make sacrifices. And people rightly point out that the greater the sacrifice that you can make, the more do you be in a place to get, essentially, right? And so the greater your probability to achieve things, well, the greater your ability to take, essentially. And you do not need to think about the taking aspect. Stop thinking about what you can take. And even that is because even if you stop thinking about what you can get, you'll still be able to get stuff, because that's just how, as Homo sapien, you are. That's how you're conditioned by your evolutionary biology. I mean, psychology, even. I think that would be more apt. And so focus upon the value that you can add, rather. And this is another very vehemently beaten aspect. When you talk about giving value, adding value, it's not just about solving somebody's existential dread or crisis. No. If you leave someone's mood better than it was before you entered the room, that's a definite value addition, and it matters significantly. And so, coming back from this little segue, sacrifice is the only currency that buys greatness. No much, no matter how much you try to find ways to balance things out, if your ideal is a version of you that does not exist yet, and the distance between that ideal and you is sufficingly large, the more you need to sacrifice, and the more consistently do you need to sustain that sacrifice. Okay, Bhaviti, you said that, okay, you want to sacrifice. People say that you need to sacrifice. I gotta sacrifice. I gotta make a sacrifice. Okay, you know what? Um, Tring tring. Hello. Yeah. Hey man. Let's catch up. Let's meet. Weekend. Yeah. Start Sunday. Nah, man. No. Cannot do. Cannot do. I'm meant for greatness. I'm really on this side quest of achieving greatness. Can't do this that Sunday. But how about Monday, or maybe the next that Sunday? That's not how it works. To close the gap, the distance between the current you and the ideal that you are chasing after, which hopefully is sufficiently um, distant from where you are right now. Well, to close that gap, you need to sacrifice not once, not twice, not every now and then, but consistently. That's the only way. And that ties into the third thing, the third aspect, which is, are you optimizing your baseline? And there's this. I really do not know who wrote that book, but there's this book, The Unfair Advantage, and the idea that discusses the idea of how each and every single one is bestowed with some form of an unfair advantage that is unique to them. And if going by that principle, let's say that you and I and everybody else individually hold these specific conditions, the specific conditioning rather that was dictated by their conditions throughout their lives, um, these conditions that become their unfair advantages. Well, in that case, why wouldn't you want to optimize this baseline of your unfair advantage to the maximal that it can be? And this is especially true for young people. You know, when you're young, you are 19, 20, 21, early 20s especially, you you are coming out of high school, you are getting into college, maybe even coming out of college, and things remain the same for your peers, for the majority of the populace, that there isn't much disjointness. Yeah, unless you are of the few outliers who are the exceptions because they really prioritized being exceptional, which then to some degree they already do become relative to those around them. But yeah, if that's not the case, then you and your peers and everybody else, they regardless of their unfair advantages, where they are in their life, even though that's different, but the baseline is relatively relatively evened out, uniformly distributed. But you need to work towards maximizing that local point towards a global maximum. And the reason for that is because you have arguably the most amount of time that you'd ever have, especially considering the period where you can do a lot, right? So, I mean, that's the main selling point of your 20s, right? You won't be ever in your early 20s again. Well, yes, you won't be, and therefore, this might be the very best time to sprint as hard and as fast as you can to cover as much distance as you can in that pursuit of your ideal. And I'll let that bleed into how things evolved during the course of the podcast, as an example. One prominent aspect that evolved was of how my questions changed, how these conversations that I had with people, they evolved. And a big chunk of it was in the relatively earlier phase, things were more emphasized towards curiosity and breadth and exploration. And when you're trying to do this breadth phase search, if that makes sense, I don't know if that's a good analogy, but yeah, if you use this breadth first approach, towards exploration and curiosity. And that certainly is one way to go on about it, and that was what I did seem to overtly tilt towards during the early phase. The later phase, however, saw a tilt towards a tighter framing, not merely um, as many things as I'm interested about, but fewer, fewer threads which were deeper. A depth first search kind of an approach. The framing of your mental model becoming sharper, minimizing the surface area of your mental model to go deeper into few but highly, well, maybe resonating or maybe is important to you threads. And learning to sit in silence, I firmly believe, is one of the most helpful ability that anybody can develop right now. And that's obviously attributed to the short attention span that the digital world tries to prompt us to. And in that case, learning to just sit by yourself might be the greatest asset that you can have, that anybody can have, in the form of a crucial skill. And it's hard. It's supposed to be hard, and more than hard, boring is one thing, and I do not really think that boring is the problem here. I think that it's just genuinely hard. I mean, you can endure boredom, but it's just harder to endure through the constant the constant cognizance of the fact that there is a lot that you can readily consume, but you are deliberately choosing against it. That's not what our brains, our behavioral patterns are trained to do. They are meant to consume to ensure survival. But the context of living that we experience, that we live, that does not demand consumption beyond what is, again, just the basics of survival. I mean, you do not need to watch reels for survival, but that gets masked with the idea of, oh, I can learn. I can learn a lot. I need to be aware of what's going on in the world. And again, I am not being a skeptic towards the entire habit of being aware about the world. I myself am very avid with geopolitics, with what's going on around in my country, my uh, surroundings, the world, the interconnectedness, the dynamics that's being played out. so much and so more. I mean, and the random discourses through history, through philosophy, through random geography facts. I mean, so on and so forth. That's fine, but after a little bit, you need to realize that you're, again, that point that we discussed out earlier. Stop focusing on taking, even if it's knowledge. Stop emphasizing solely on hoarding stuff. Get out of this habit of wanting to hoard. What's essential is to get in the habit of creating, of materializing tangible outcomes that not only that may not definitely serve you in the short term, but are nonetheless of this intrinsic value in terms of much more than what would benefit you in the short term. You do not need to train or work out. I mean, first you must know a lot about it, about nutrition, about what's the right way to optimize for hypertrophy, or how about we go on to learn how to develop this calisthenics program that is tailored to us, or know the right martial art to pick. Which is the right martial art to pick? Should I begin with Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu, or should I just start out with throwing hands after joining a boxing academy? Or maybe I just want to play cricket, or just some random weekly basketball sessions. You do not need to know it all. You need to do it. You need to do it. And eventually, you will know it. You do it, you'll have the actual feedback of your actions that will first be teaching you things. And more than that, it will be teaching you what you do not know. And then you'll specifically be looking forth towards what you do not know, knowing what you do not know. And that is way better, way more efficient in terms of you finally starting to learn that said matter and concern, than you trying to become a complete expert in the matter before setting your foot out at all. And so tying that up sort of optimize your baseline, regardless of where you are in your life. Like even though I right now do think that uh, these 20s, they are the people in their 20s, they need to the most optimize their baseline, because after that, I mean, all of you, every single one of us, we are in the battlefield. But in your early years, you are not really in the battlefield. You just have this promise of how you will be in the battlefield in a few years, two, three, four, whatever. And so, if you know that you will be fighting an inevitable, you'll inevitably be fighting an invariable war that will go on for the rest of your life, well, I mean, after 2, 3, 4 years, I mean, I really would want to do all that I can to be as skillful at honing my Well, holding my sword and then honing myself to survive in general. The first was, well, not about victory, it's about making sense, it's about optimizing a baseline, and then before that, between those two, we talked about how sacrifice is the only currency that buys greatness. Now, before moving on to the fourth pointer, um, taking a little bit of a tangent, I would want to discuss about a few aspects that I didn't expect to see because I really did not ruminate or contemplated over it before. Across all the physicists, AI researchers, leaders, founders, thinkers in general, there are three key behaviors that I observed. A lot, but these three systemic observations that I have: uncertainty, th- their acceptance to uncertainty as a default setting. Uncertainty is the sole truth of living. Well, death is the sole truth of life, but of living, uncertainty is the sole truth of living. And every individual who has an admirable mental space and is to any degree successful in whatever they seek to be doing, they intrinsically have this acceptance to the recurrent arrival of uncertain situations. Why that is important, in my opinion, is because when you have something of this measure that is a seminal part of all that you do and all that you do not do, and when you have no way of knowing what this thing may materialize into, what is the best way to prepare yourself to be able to handle it? Best way to handle it is to not be surprised the least bit when it sprouts in front of you. And as basic as it may seem, it is not. It is hard to work your arse off towards doing something and then seeing all of it being turned to crisp because of something that just was. I worked my arse off to pull off a deal with a multi-billion dollar company, a big giant, and everything was set and done, but at the last moment, the deal falls off. Not because of any lacking or fault or parameter that is attributed to me at all, but something that just is. The company gets a lawsuit that they lose. Nothing I could have done. I mean, that's a bad example, oh my god, but nonetheless, you work hard for something, you give your all towards it, you see the finish line, but suddenly you trip over. You just trip over. You can't do much about it. Well, fine. You pivot. Instead of focusing on being the winner, getting that gold, I now need to focus upon how I can bag that goddamn silver. Because I tripped, and that lad who was just a few inches here and there to me, he took off and has a lead, and he'll definitely be finishing the line before I do. I need to make sure that, firstly, I do not fall. I tripped, right? I do not want to fall. Hopefully, I want to regain my balance without ceasing to run, and then make sure that I do not let the lads behind me get that lead over me. Frame of mind. That's what frame of mind does. That's why it's important. The second aspect is knowing about limits matter more than knowing about capabilities. And taking from what we were just discussing a little while back, you do not have to know everything, right? Before starting that thing. What you do need to know are the inherent limitations or constraints that there are from the very onset. Some XYZ individual, let's say they want to lose their, well, they want to lose a few pounds. I don't know why I'm going back to that example, but yeah, they want to lose a few pounds, and they have not, they have not ran in a decade or two, to say the least. Walking gets them to pant, and well, going to the gym 7 days a week, 6 days a week, I mean, not really possible. You have limitations, you have maybe a few heart problems, maybe some muscle fatigue, or some issues with bone density, so on and so forth. We'll know all of those beforehand, and be very, very considerate of those when you start walking down the path of losing those few pounds. You can get jacked and ripped, sure, but you've got weak bones and you need to take that into consideration. Otherwise, you are going to just break your bones in plural, left, right, and center. Gonna get bedridden and really tragically, maybe even gain fat more than you had before. You do not have capital, financial capital, but you want to start well, a deep tech venture, or you want to become a VC. Well, don't go on to buy those domains or creating that website. Try to create your war chest, as they call it, your treasury first. Build that skill set. Work at some fund, VC fund, right? Create connections, networks. Get this knack for taking bets and getting them right. And eventually, when your treasury is to a considerable magnitude, well, then that's when you take the leap. Be cognizant of your limits more than your capabilities. Be cognizant of your capabilities, sure. Be more curious about what your limits are, and then find ways to surpass those limitations if you have to. Some limitations are really not worth surpassing, some are. I ran 10 kilometers. I want to push myself beyond that. I know I goddamn can. So I do. I surpass my limitations then and there. But I had just broke my hand a few months back. After a long while, I'm back at the gym. How about I do not overly ego lift? At least, with that hand and concern, or that shoulder concern. And then the third thing, um, they are ridiculously aware that progress is messy, it's non-linear, it's lackluster, and it's deeply human. Progress is deeply human. It is lackluster. There is, at least in the start, there is no way to quantify the progress that you're making at the beginning, because it takes time. It becomes very quantifiable once you garner that momentum. And this can be for anything. Like, I want to master genetic engineering or molecular biology. Yeah. And I know I got to learn a little bit of gene sequencing, machine learning here and there, maybe CRISPR, learn about that, learn about, in general, the fundamentals of biology. I know I got to do all of this, and I start with it. Well, am I going to measure my progress in terms of how many books that I read, or in terms of how many papers were I able to publish? No, that would be stupid. That would be beyond foolish to measure things, or attempt at measuring things that way at the beginning. And if you may be enrolled, and if that's your degree or something, then, I mean, if that's a coursework, you may not be suddenly getting A grades in it. Do not measure progress through that either. Oh, tying back, the first thing, measure your progress in terms of sense making. How much more sense are you able to make of whatever that you are doing? That's how you measure progress, at least in the start. And eventually, when you get in that momentum, you automatically learn what are the right features. You know how you feature select while creating a model? Well, how do you know which features are the right ones for you to measure for your performance? Well, firstly, you optimize or you think about progress through how much more sense things make to you. And eventually, when you start gathering momentum, you will be a better judge of what features are truly essential and which are not, and which are more than the others relative to others, to quantify and thereby measure the progress here on forth. So, again, across scientists, physicists, AI researchers, thinkers, all of them, the three common denominators that I observed were that their acceptance to uncertainty as a default, being highly aware about limitations and knowing that limits matter more than capabilities, and finally, being ridiculously knowing of how progress is deeply human. And once you do that, you know, once you reach that expertise, some form of that, that is the reason why it is quieter than, you know, that is quieter in general. There comes a level of humility and humbleness. Now, it doesn't for everybody, but ideally it does. You understand that you are only a cog in the mechanism of the entirety of the machine that your life and living is. Surely the most important cog might be even the most colossal cog, but still one cog. Now, there is a lot that I would want to discuss in terms of the technological insights or the scientific insights, the technical details, if you may, that I have really uh, fancied over this past few time. But let's try to not make it overtly disjoint and long. And so, sticking to the fourth thing, the fourth point. So, well, we talked about. Okay, I really am repeating these pointers again and again, but yeah, bear with me. So, how it's not about a victory, not a winning. It's about making sense. How sacrifice is the only currency that buys greatness, optimizing your baseline, and then I talked about a lot of anecdotal things here and there. Then the patterns, the observational patterns that I found common in thinkers and the most successful of thinkers. And moving on to one of the most severely critical aspects is what I term as the illusion of unhappiness. So, what do I mean by the illusion of unhappiness? More often than not, people fail to elongate the happy moments and instead remain hell-bent upon focusing on expectations or comparative miseries. And how do you fail to elongate the happy moments? You fail to do so by not reflecting or ruminating enough upon them. And all that leads to is simply intensifying despondence and giving off this illusion of unhappiness, of how your existence is dimmed with suffering and misery and devoid of any elation at all, which is not true. Suffering and misery are surely just as hard of truths of life, of living, as happiness and hope are. However, it is the proprietor's independent and sole responsibility to not give in to the despondence, which only happens when you are holding on to the moments of happiness and flickers of hope that they breed. When the going gets tough, that is what will take you through. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for turning in. For the future of the podcast, of the show, there will be a lot more topics and matters that I would want to talk about with a platitude of guests. And yeah, a lot more of the first principles framing and lesser and lesser of the surface level scratching. And so, hoping to make the conversations more and more theoretical while being gently implementable. And so, if you want to think, if you want to think really, not stay informed solely, if you are optimizing for finding out the depths more than the breadths, join us in this journey of uncovering these discourses. That's it from my side. This conversation, for this deliberation, for this discourse. Thank you so very much. Take care and see you soon.